Hey everybody, I'm going to do a quick rundown of the brand new Transition Regulator CX. This bike is essentially a motorized version of the Sentinel that launched a few months ago. It uses Bosch's Performance CX motor paired with a 600 watt-hour battery. And you can also add on a range extender that gives you 250 more watt-hours of juice. Travel mount, you got 150 millimeters in the rear, 160 up front, and you can increase that by running a longer stroke shock. If you run a 65 mil stroke shock, that'll give you 160 millimeters of rear travel. Geometry, again, almost identical to the Sentinel. This bike does come set up mixed wheel. It's mixed wheel only. You can't run it as a 29er. So you've got 448 to 450 mil chain stays in the size large, 475 or 480 reach in the size large, and the head angle can be adjusted. That's either at 64.5 or 64 degrees. So pretty contemporary numbers, kind of your modern enduro-ish, all mountain kind of thing. Other than that, pretty straightforward. Nothing super out of the ordinary, just a very nice, well-designed bike with a motor and a battery, and you pedal it and it goes. Speaking of going, let's get into the ride impressions and see how this thing held up to a couple months of extra sloppy riding. Regulator is a great bike for exploring. This isn't some big behemoth that only works well if you're flying up fire roads and then descending gnarly trails. Instead, it's impressively maneuverable, especially in that high geometry setting. Now, I'm someone that usually takes a bike, puts it in the low and slack setting, and calls it good, but in this instance, I like the Regulator a lot in the high setting. Just gives it a little bit more liveliness. It was beneficial on some of those flatter trails, a little bit more roll-in terrain, and still worked well on the descents. So if you're the type of rider that enjoys getting up weird technical climbs almost as much or maybe more than you like descending, the Regulator could fit the bill. It also descends well too, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now, there's several factors that combine to make this bike such a great climber. First, there's those teeny tiny 150 mil cranks. I didn't realize how short the cranks were until partway through my first ride. I kind of knew something was a little bit different, and I looked down and realized just how short and stubby those things are. They may look a little funny, but they work really well. You're less likely to smack a pedal, and that means you can just keep pedaling, keep getting power to the rear wheel, even in really chunky, chopped up terrain. The Bosch motor is part of the equation here too. Very smooth power delivery. There's kind of an arms race going on at the moment. Motor manufacturers are trying to up their system's torque, but that output needs to be controllable. Otherwise, the bike's going to want to spin out or spit the rider off, especially if you're in slippery or steeper terrain. So that CX motor responds very well to a variety of pedaling speeds, and you don't have to pedal wildly to hit the sweet spot. As for other factors that contribute to this thing being such a good climber, those Schwalbe Albert radial casing tires, they work great in pretty much all conditions other than super deep mud. And then you've got the good geometry, very well balanced, puts you right in the center of the bike. And then the suspension feels like traction has priority. It's really supple off the top. That rear wheel can kind of really contour to the ground. And if this is a regular non-motorized pedal bike, it might feel almost a little bit mushy, but I think in this instance it works very well because you're not worried about a little bit of bob here and there if that means that your rear wheel is keeping the grip and keeping you going forward. I tested the new Sentinel a few months ago as part of our fall field test. I wasn't totally blown away by its performance. It did what it was supposed to, but there were times when it felt longer than I expected, and I'm someone that's typically a fan of longer chain stays. Perhaps it had to do with the dual 29-inch wheels, but in any case, it's a different story with the Regulator. The smaller rear wheel and the extra weight around the bottom bracket give it a much different riding characteristic, despite the fact that the geometry numbers are identical to that Sentinel. Set up at 30% sag, it felt nice and plush, with a good level of sensitivity off the top to absorb those chattery portions of trail. The bike's planted when it needs to be, but it's also not that hard to get it up off the ground or to navigate through tighter, stranger sections of trail. One of my favorite local trails has a series of tight switchbacks followed by a section with a series of steep drops, and each of those drops is a couple bike lengths apart. Basically, imagine a set of dirt stairs that were designed by Salvador Dali. Nothing really lines up in quite the right way, and it's not something you can just sit back and hold on and blast through and hope for the best. You really need good brake control, and you gotta plop down in just the right spot. The Regulator took it all in stride. I was really impressed by how easy it was to place it exactly where I wanted. The descending position is centered and upright, and it really does have that in-the-bike sensation, as cliche as that term may be. The bigger drops and hits were all handled without issues. You've got that hydraulic bottom out on the shock, and that helps make sure that catches you nicely if you're using most of the travel. Although I probably would run a little less sag for drier, faster conditions. 30% felt good in the slop, but a little more support would be good for hitting hard-packed berms and jumps. I gotta say, there was a moment when it seemed like Transition was going to continue down the longer and slacker road forever, but their recent bikes have bucked the trend, in some cases getting a little steeper than before. With the Regulator, this geometry recipe works very well. Comfortable in a wide variety of terrain, and I think a wide range of riders could also enjoy this bike. It doesn't feel like a big, massive brute, and I think that helps. Just kind of a fun, good all-rounder, no matter the terrain and no matter the conditions. Well, that's how this thing rides. Let's talk about the components. I mentioned those 150 millimeter cranks already. Big fan of those. Hopefully that most e-bikes in the future come with them. I just think it makes so much sense when you're cranking uphill or going downhill. Just don't want any pedal strikes. Short cranks, the way to go when you've got a motor involved. TRP DHR Evo brakes, those worked really well. I like the previous version. These are pretty much the same thing. I felt that the power is almost identical, just the lever is a little bit more adjustable, which was one thing people complained about before. So now it's nice to have the option to adjust it. Let's talk about battery life. I think some people are going to see that 600 watt hour number on the spec sheet and say, oh, that's not enough. And I think you'd be surprised. You know, I'm someone that does like to have a larger battery. I don't like having range anxiety. I just want to go out and ride and ride and ride and go home and not have to watch the bars and wonder when my bike is going to turn into a very, very heavy bike. 600 watt hours I can get, kind of depends on, you know, obviously conditions and steepness and all of that, but somewhere around 4,000 vertical feet of ascending, you know, on the trails around here. I definitely did like having the range extender, and I would recommend anybody that's, you know, thinking they might have some range anxiety to find even more money and purchase that range extender. Unfortunately, it's around $500, so it's pretty expensive on top of an already not inexpensive bike. But as it is in the stock form with a 600 watt hour battery, you can get some pretty decent rides in there. Yeah, I think it's a balancing act. And I don't think that they made the wrong choice, but I could see some people wishing that stock was that 800 watt hour battery. So again, that's why there's different options out there in the world. This might not be the flashiest bike out there, and Transition even bills it as the workhorse all-mountain machine. But I think that's accurate. It's a bike that does what it's supposed to, no fuss, very quiet, and just kind of works. And I think for plenty of riders, that's gonna be exactly what you're looking for. Not everything has to be crazy flashy colors and extra pivots and wild, you know, joined tubes and titanium and all that. It's just kind of, I don't know, it's an e-bike. It works, it's got a battery, it's got a motor. It goes up the hill really well, it goes down the hill really well. That's what you're into. That's the Transition Regulator CX. But before we finish this up, I should mention how it compares to the Transition Repeater. That's kind of their current big dog, 170 mils of travel, front and rear, 29-inch wheels. And realistically, I don't think I'd recommend the Repeater at all anymore now that this exists. You know, the Repeater has the SRAM powertrain, and that only has a couple different motor modes, not that tunable. This Bosch motor, much more tunable. So this thing's 6 pounds lighter than the Repeater. Powertrain. And you can beef this up a little bit, you know, you can get more travel, but it already has a ZEB on it. So it's not as if it's a under-spec'd bike. So even if you tossed on some downhill tires, you're still looking at maybe 48, 49 pounds, you know, still lighter than the regular Repeater. So yeah, if you're going between those two, I definitely think the Regulator takes the win right now. All right, well, that's a wrap on the brand new Transition Regulator. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hop in the comments. Let me know what you think. Does this bike fit what you're looking for in an e-bike? Is there something missing? What do you think the future holds for these things? Are you tired of e-bikes? Do you want us to just go back to only regular bikes? Let us know. I'll read them and I'll respond to some of them. Catch you next time.